What's going on YouTube? It's Teach back again with another video. Today I'm giving you my final regular season NFL power rankings. Hopefully you all enjoyed today's video. If you do, hit that like button, it would help me out a ton. And if you're new to the channel, want to help us get to 400 subscribers and like what you see, hit that big red subscribe button. And of course, most importantly, comment your takeaways of these power rankings down in the comment section. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Who's your favorite team? Where do you think they should be in these final power rankings? And there is a little bit something different. I have to give a huge shout out to Majestic-YT. Left a comment on one of my power rankings from I think 3 weeks ago, and he basically said instead of talking about who's up X amount or who's down X amount, why don't you put where you had this team in your preseason rankings? I thought that was a really cool idea. So the numbers you'll see next to the team today is where I had them in my very first power rankings of the year before the regular season began. So it's kind of a fun thought experiment, and I decided to do it for today's video. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Giants, they come in at number 32. It's just a tough way to end the year. If you have Mike Glennon and Jake Fromm as your guys in your final 2 to 3 games of the year, that's obviously not ideal. Saquon Barkley, didn't look good. The offensive line, it's just abysmal. Everybody's talking about how Kenny Golladay doesn't really feel like he's worth the $18 million a year, and I think a lot of that is a product of the environment around him. And the defense, it just wasn't, it could only do so much down the stretch considering how bad that offense was. So, this is crazy. I don't necessarily think, especially if they're fully healthy and at full strength, I don't think the Giants are the worst team in the league, but, you have Dave Gettleman retire today. It's a good time for turning a new leaf for the Giants. Same thing for the Panthers, right? Kind of competitive to start the game against Tampa Bay, but, as the game plays out, it looked like what we would have expected between the Bucs and the Panthers suiting up. And this is a spot where, there's been some trade rumors around Chris McCaffrey. Apparently, that is off the table for Carolina. Matt Rule still seems to be the guy before going into his third year as the head coach. So, still trying to build up that culture and build up the talent level. I think they got it on the defensive side. Now it comes to figuring out the quarterback spot. And we'll talk about, Deshaun Watson a couple times with a few different teams here in this video. But especially with what Miami did today as of me recording this on Monday, maybe Carolina is the front runner now for Deshaun Watson. So we'll see. And if that happens, then obviously that changes a ton about how you look at this team. The Jags fall 3 spots from my preseason rankings to where they end up finishing the year, but they end the year with a win, and they play spoiler. The spoiler of all spoilers. I mean, the Colts haven't won in Jacksonville since, 2014, 2015. How many times did you hear that throughout the week? And then the Jags did it again. They've gone through so much. I know that felt amazing for Darrell Bevell, and Trevor Lawrence looked really good. They used Laviska Shenault in ways I kind of thought they would all year long. And it was just kind of nice to see that offense assume the role that we figured we were going to be getting this year as opposed to the dumpster fire it's been for the most part this year. And the defense, the pass rush in specific was there. Josh Allen had a pretty good game, first time in a long time too. So good way to end the year for the Jags, and you still get to keep the number 1 overall pick. So you get a win, and you solidify that you will have your choice between Aiden Hutchinson, Evan Neal, Kayvon Thibodeau, whoever you want at number 1. The Jets at number 29. I think they actually ended the year on a pretty decent note. I know they lost Week 18, but Zack Wilson, as the year went on, started to get a little better. Still wasn't fantastic, right? But you could see a little bit of incremental progress, and, the offensive line felt like it got a little more steady as the year went on. Michael Carter started to show you some flashes. You got some good play from Elijah Moore late in the year. You still got to figure out that defense, right? Maybe one more pass rusher obviously would have helped if you had Carl Lawson this year, tore his ACL in the preseason. And then, maybe beef up the secondary. And, you have 2 top 10 picks as it stands right now. So, that's certainly a path they can take. But this is still a team that, despite my hype on them before the year, now I say hype, clearly they were number 26 in my preseason power rankings. I wasn't drinking too much Kool-Aid there. But I thought the Jets had a chance to be a semi-competitive team, and at least when you turn on the TV, you knew they could be close-ish games. And maybe they were a year away from that, but there's still some young talent budding there, and maybe one more draft, one more offseason where they can splurge a little bit in free agency, rookie contract with your quarterback. You can really improve your crop of talent on the roster. Texans, one of the best. Them and the Lions. How about this? Number 32 and 31 in my preseason power rankings. And, let's not get ahead of ourselves. They're 28-27. They're still among the worst teams in the NFL. But these 2 teams, I think, have made a compelling argument specifically with how I look at potential head coaching candidates. David Culley, Dan Campbell would not have been the first 2 names that came to my mind for the next head coaches for these teams. At least for Dan Campbell, former Lions player, he's, assistant head coach and a tight ends coach. helps build up that culture in New Orleans, and that's a stable franchise. I understood that. And the same can be said about David Culley. I'm pretty sure he was an assistant head coach under John Harbaugh, and again, comes from a great organization, and he's seen it done at a high level. So, but those two guys, you don't look at and say, okay, well, this offensive tree, that's going to be a great fit for X wide receiver, and this quarterback, and this running back's going to fit in great. Or you don't look at them and say, this defense is going to take another step forward. Not quite. But these two guys did a great job exceeding expectations, and week in and week out, it felt like those players bought into what they were trying to do. Like, there's no real motivation for Chris Conley to go out there and try to play well for Houston. But, he had a couple of good moments down the stretch. And, Chris Conley's just a name I'm pulling out of the top of my head. But that's the accumulation of players on this Texans roster, right? And it was Danny Amendola this past week balling out for Houston. Just a Nick Caserio guy from that New England branch. And he has a big game. Why he's still playing, I don't know. And then for the Lions, it's a little bit of a different story. Really, it's been the younger players. Amon-Ra St. Brown, that's been great. And DeAndre Swift got back and suited up this past week, which was exciting to see if you're a Lions fan. But these two guys, I feel like, have put a little bit more onus on the idea of, you may not be an offensive wizard or a defensive mastermind, but can you bring some stability? And can you get players motivated to play for you? And if so, there's a spot for you as a potential head coach. And maybe that's something I was overlooking in years prior, saying, okay, well, this guy comes from this offensive tree, that's going to work in this, this type of setting. And this guy's a defensive wizard, perfect fit, that's what they need. Maybe it's just about, hey, I need buy-in from players, especially when you look at somehow Mike Tomlin has willed the Steelers. I don't want to say he has willed the Steelers, but big part of why the Steelers have made the playoffs. And, John Harbaugh in Baltimore knocking on the door of doing the same thing. So maybe there is something to the culture and players, coaches in general, and maybe the Lions and the Texans are onto something with Dan Campbell and David Culley, though I know there have been some rumors that Culley might be out after 1 year, but I kind of hope he sticks around, at least for one more year. I think Tim Kelly did an okay job as the OC, especially as the year went on, and he could get a little bit more out of Davis Mills. Maybe you replace Lovie Smith as the defensive coordinator. I think he's got an outdated scheme for the modern NFL, but I think there's still something to work with there, considering where we thought this team would be by this time of the year. Falcons pretty much right around where I had them in my preseason power ranking. This is pretty much where they lived, and there's like 27 to 23, 22 range all year long. There were weeks where maybe they looked pretty good on the offensive side, and then there were weeks where they just looked like they might have rolled over and dropped dead. The Falcons are a really inconsistent team and a weird team to try to peg in these power rankings, but for the most part, they were in and around this neighborhood, and I feel like that's about right. And the Broncos down 5 spots. You see Vic Fangio on your screen. He was fired today on Monday when I'm recording this. And, we'll talk about the Vikings' Mike Zimmer in a little bit. We'll talk about the Dolphins' Brian Flores. Off topic for the Broncos, great year to hire a defensive coordinator, right? Fangio, Zimmer, and Flores, if they're all looking for jobs and don't want to take a year off or retire or whatever, those three guys could potentially be three of, if not the best three defensive coordinators in football if they get a job and the personnel to take full advantage of what they're thinking and what's going on between the years. So, kind of an interesting offseason to jump off from. But for the Denver Broncos, they've already put in an interview to try to talk to Nathaniel Hackett. It feels like the sweepstakes for Aaron Rodgers has begun with that first domino falling. So this Denver team, we've said it all year long, a lot of talent all over the roster. I don't think Drew Lock necessarily played terrible, but Saturday kind of highlighted the problem that good Drew Lock games still are not enough to win. And, part of it's also self-inflicted wounds, the fumble 6. After Gordon coughs it up, Nick Bolton scampers it into the end zone. So, some self-inflicted wounds there for sure. Definitely didn't help Denver. But this is a team that if they get it right at the quarterback position, you'll start to see that snowball effect in a positive direction for this team. And really the first domino might be that head coaching job. I was hoping they would hold on to Fangio, bring in a Rodgers, a Wilson, a Watson maybe, and let them basically be the hiring committee for the offensive coordinator. To me, that felt like the best of both worlds, where Fangio still gets to coach at the defense. Whoever they get as a quarterback gets to get their offensive guy in there. But maybe it's just moving in a new direction entirely, and that seems to be the route in place for Denver. On to the top 24, the Washington football team. One of the biggest disappointments for me this year. I bought into what that defense looked like on paper, and I thought Ryan Fitzpatrick would be, stable enough. I liked the group of playmakers, huge Antonio Gibson guy. And throughout the year, Terry McLaurin had some good games, and when we got to see Curtis Samuel, I liked how Scott Turner was using him in that offense, and I obviously still a huge Antonio Gibson guy, and if anything, Jared Patterson's a nice added addition into the mix, and I know it wasn't Ryan Fitzpatrick, but Taylor Heinicke is just like the younger, more interesting cooler story and his background version of Ryan Fitzpatrick. It just comes down, do you want to talk about a guy who's in his 40s, or do you want to talk about a guy who's a walk-on, or undrafted player, used to play at ODU and became, a pseudo household name last playoffs with a big game against Tampa Bay. It's just like, which broadcaster story do you want to hear at the beginning of the game? But they're pretty much the same guy. The offense wasn't nearly good enough, right? And again, it's kind of like Denver. You get that one upgrade at the most important position, and things will open up from that point onward. But this defense was also slow to start during the year. The secondary in specific was pretty rough. And then as it felt like they got better in the secondary, and that unit started to play more as a unit, you lose Chase Young, and then the pass rush starts to slip. So that's a really tough look, and overall Washington was just a little disappointing this year. Chicago, right around where I thought they would be. They fired Matt Nagy. They fired Ryan Pace. This is among the most intriguing and appealing jobs out there for head coaching jobs. I'm thinking about doing a video either this weekend or next, ranking the open head coaching jobs. And the Bears might be number one just because Justin Fields was, top 3 player on my draft board. It was Lawrence, Wilson, and Fields weighing in position value. And you still saw those moments throughout the year. And, keep in mind this team played without Khalil Mack down the stretch. Robert Quinn looked really good this year. Maybe if you have Mack back next year, and those two, as a pass rushing duo, complement each other pretty well next year. But Quinn is up and down, so it's hard to expect and anticipate that for sure. But this becomes a spot where, with Nagy out the door, an offensive head coach might just do anything they can to get this job, to get their hands on Justin Fields. And additionally, some of the assets moving forward. I know no first-round pick this year, but beyond that, they're pretty well endowed in regards to having their picks. And then also eventually, your cap spending privileges are going to start to open up, and you lose Allen Robinson this year. What can you do recreating that wide receiver core? I can just see an offensive-minded guy seeing this job and seeing, wow, this is just a pile of clay. I can mold it how I want, and I already have the most important position, quote unquote, figured out with Justin Fields. So I could see that being a really appetizing job. But for this year, they were just kind of meh, below average, mediocre, however you want to put it. Ravens, another big disappointment, but at least with Washington, it wasn't because they let me down based off my expectations. Baltimore just, one, ran out of bodies, it felt like, and then two, just the injuries and the key position groups. There was just nothing they were going to do. Tyler Huntley was a nice story, but he's obviously a step down from Lamar Jackson. Had to start Josh Johnson for a game, losing Marcus Peters in the preseason, then losing Marlon Humphrey a little over halfway through the year. There's just not much more that this team really could have done with those types of losses. So this is just a team that kind of lost steam as the year went on, and as the bodies started to hit the COVID list, the injury reserve, the path to playoffs became that much more narrow. So tough year for Baltimore, but in a lot of ways, John Harbaugh is one of his best coaching performances of all time. And you still see the pride within that organization. You see that they're going to play hard and give everybody a run from start to finish of every game they play, no matter who's out on the field, right? Giving Green Bay a run for their money, playing close games with Pittsburgh, who's in the playoffs. So I still think there's some positive signs long term if you're a Ravens fan. Seattle, down a couple spots, and it's actually interesting. We'll talk about this when we get to Arizona, but had these two teams right next to each other, and the NFC West is that division we all saw, hey, if there's a division to send 3 teams, it's the NFC West, but who's that team to be left out? And I had the Cardinals ranked as 17th in my preseason power rankings, but I had the Seahawks as 16th. To me, it was a lot closer between those two than I think a lot of people saw it. And it was kind of easy to say, hey, the Cardinals are the weakest team here. Cliff Kingsbury's not proving anything. They have one legit playmaker that we know is good. Is Kyler Murray ready to take that step forward towards an MVP type of candidate? What does that secondary look like? But the Cardinals answered a lot of their questions. Meanwhile, Seattle did not, right? The offensive line did not get better. The offensive scheme did not help make the lives of Wilson, Lockett, Metcalf, and company easier. The rushing attack the last 3 weeks with Rashad Penny, weirdly enough, was pretty rough all year. And the defense, the secondary was putrid. They had next to no pass rush for the most part. And you have Bobby Wagner trying to do it all. So, this is obviously a disappointing time for Seattle. They're reviewing their relationship with Pete Carroll as we recording this. By the time this comes out tomorrow, Tuesday when you're seeing it, they might have already moved on. So I can't speak to anything there, but this team has a huge domino in how this offseason will play out. And overall, who's going where and who might stay put. Seattle's a huge part of that conversation, so I'm excited to see what they do. Cleveland Browns, I had them at number 3. I honestly couldn't believe I did that when I was reviewing that. But wow, what a fall from grace. This is 2 times in the last 3 years that we've seen Cleveland do this, right? The Freddie Kitchens head coaching year, there was a ton of buzz, right? OBJ, first full year in the offense, and Baker looked good as a rookie, and they got a lot of talent everywhere. Those first-round draft picks all over the roster. Okay, they're ready to make that leap. And then Freddie Kitchens was a disaster, and that was rough. And then the expectations are lowered. They hire Kevin Stefanski, and then boom, they're in the playoffs. They get a win against the Steelers. And now, clearly my expectations, along with many others, you see a complete roster, and you see Baker Mayfield coming off his best year of his career so far. How can this team not be one of the top 5? And I had them in the top 3, but they had some injuries throughout the year, but overall the defense was not the problem. The offensive line was able to stay intact for the most part, and even when they had injuries to Chubb or Kareem Hunt, Dearness Johnson stepped up. Really, this team fell from 3 to 20 in my preseason to final regular season rankings because Baker Mayfield was one of, if not the most disappointing player in the NFL this year. Hot take maybe, but he let this team down. And I know he's playing hurt, but those circumstances are a part of it, right? Like if he wasn't healthy, maybe this is on the organization to play Case Keenum, right? He's one of the better backup quarterbacks in the league. And then you have Nick Mullen, who might be the best third stringer in the NFL. So whether it's because maybe the Browns should have played Keenum or Mullins when they had to over an injured Mayfield, or Baker Mayfield just needed to play better, or maybe it's on Stefanski for calling the quote-unquote good plays, right? And they had to trade Odell Beckham Jr. for a week. It looked like this team was back on track, but then after that, they looked like they were missing a man-beating, number 1, need a first down type of wide receiver. And, Donovan Peoples-Jones had some field-stretching ability, but he's just not a number 1. He is a complimentary guy. So maybe in the draft, this team, can add a Garrett Wilson, a Chris Olave, Drake London, whoever could be that wide receiver 1, and this offense can really hit its stride. But like I said, Baker Mayfield's the most disappointing player in the league in my eyes, based off of what I had my expectations set at, where I thought this team could be because of that. So Browns down to 20. I still can't believe I had them at 3 in my preseason rankings. I feel really foolish right now. Saints actually up 5 spots. So that should be green. I was super low on the New Orleans Saints, and they exceeded my expectations, especially with Jameis Winston. I think Sean Payton did a great job reeling in Jameis. You still had those moments in games entirely where it could be a bit of a roller coaster and you could be a little turnover prone, but the defense balled out. Ton of credit to Dennis Allen. I think this is his best work as a defensive coordinator. And also, interim head coach blanks Tampa Bay 9-0 on Sunday Night Football. Like, Dennis Allen did a ton this year to garner a whole lot of respect from across the league, but also garner potential head coaching interviews. So really impressed by what he did with that defense. And I also think this is a defense that probably talent-wise and also considering depth isn't as good as it was last year. They lost a lot of pieces, obviously Trey Hendrickson, and you lose some depth in the secondary as well. I just think Dennis Allen did a fantastic job this year, and Sean Payton worked his magic. And legitimately, I thought he could have been coach of the year. If Jameis Winston finishes this year and the Saints get in the playoffs, that's one of the best what-ifs that could have come this year. But even after Winston, he got more out of Trevor Siemian than I thought possible. Ian Book was a bit of a disaster. I won't lie there, and that's coming from a Notre Dame fan. And then Taysom Hill, they found an offense that worked for the most part when he was able to play. His injury proneness this year was a little disappointing, but the Saints really did exceed my expectations. Now, that is a little tough to say considering they're still at 19, but I had them at 24, and I was fading the Saints like no other. They proved that even with Jameis Winston, this team can be competitive, especially if they have defense with stars across the board and Dennis Allen as that DC kind of pulling the string. So very impressed with New Orleans despite them narrowly missing the playoffs. Miami Dolphins are down 3 spots from where I had them in the preseason. They fired Brian Flores today. That was a huge shocker to me. And my, off the top of my head, conspiracy, nut job theory, maybe they're going to hire Eric Bieniemy, right? Keep in mind, Deshaun Watson wanted Houston to at least interview Bieniemy last year, and then they didn't. And then that was part of the unraveling of that relationship between Houston and Watson. So maybe this is a spot where I know Deshaun Watson like Brian Flores, though, so that's where this theory kind of maybe loses some of its momentum. But maybe it's a spot where you fire Flores, you bring in Bieniemy, you make the situation that much more appealing. They did keep GM Chris Greer, who is someone Deshaun Watson has respect for, and you're just trying to make it that much more of an appealing spot by going offensive minority coach that we know you like versus a defensive minority coach that we know you like as well. Additionally, it also feels like an excuse maybe to move on from the co-offensive coordinators this year. It's just tough to have a coach in 3 years hire 3 different offensive play callers. It is a little different because this year they had 2. Regardless, Didn't see this change coming because I do think Brian Flores is a really good defensive coach, and he's another good culture, players coach type of guy. But man, he will make an offense, great defensive coordinator, awesome defensive coordinator is what I was trying to say there. But Dolphins right around this area for the most part all year long. Sometimes got up, I think, as high as to 12 a couple weeks ago. But limited offense because of a terrible offensive line. And, outside of Jalen Waddle, I'm still not enthralled by their playmakers. Not having Will Fuller feels like a big loss for what this offense could have been. That said, I mean, with that offensive line, are really pushing the ball down the field all that often to Will Fuller? Probably not. And, because of that, the rushing attack really couldn't get off the ground. The defense, I think overall was pretty good. Obviously looked fantastic against bad quarterbacks, and even against good quarterbacks, I think they were able to hold their own, especially when you consider with how bad that offense can be. Like, think of the Tennessee game in Week 17. The offense is 3 and out, turnover, 3 and out. They're just leaving their defense out to dry. So sometimes the points added up against the defense doesn't tell the entire story. So this is a spot where maybe you're saying, if you're Chris Greer or you're Stephen Ross, the owner of the Dolphins, hey, the defense is already good. A lot of talent on that side. We've invested a ton that side of the football. Let's go get an offensive guy. Let's go make a run at Deshaun Watson or some veteran quarterback, and let's go win the whole damn thing. So maybe that's the plan, but we'll see in the coming weeks. Pittsburgh Steelers actually down a spot from last week, but up a spot from my preseason ranking. I decided to switch them to the Vikings, who you'll see here at 16 in just a moment. But this Pittsburgh team is just I really no words, right? Like, this is probably the worst playoff team I've ever seen. Like, right up there with the 7-9 Seattle Seahawks that then beat the New Orleans Saints in the wild card round that Marshawn Lynch, induced a literal earthquake in Seattle. So this is among the worst teams, at least with that Seattle team. You could say Tim Hasselbeck could push the ball down the field a little bit. Big Ben has just given up on that completely, and it's kind of unfortunate. I am a Steelers fan, so I'm excited to see this team make the playoffs, and I'm happy that Mike Tomlin gets another playoff appearance under his belt. Yada yada yada. Good for some of the young players, but this is a spot where I kind of feel bad for Big Ben because he could have, let's say, if the Chargers-Raiders game, which we'll talk about here very shortly, and I'm excited to just talk about it. If that game ends at a tie, maybe, and Pittsburgh misses out on the playoffs, Big Ben's career ends with a gritty Monday Night Football primetime win at home against the Browns. And then he takes down the Ravens in the season finale, and he makes sure Baltimore doesn't get in the playoffs. And that's a storybook way for him to go out. Now it feels like he got those 2 wins. He's going to play Kansas City, and Pittsburgh is going to get their ass handed to him in his final game of his career. And that's a little less exciting and a little less fun to talk about. So a little bit of bad luck, but overall the Steelers' defense is still really good, and they're making plays for the offense, right? Whether it's giving them short fields or it's creating turnovers and creating points off of those turnovers. So Pittsburgh is probably going to lose to Kansas City in the 7-2 matchup next week, but good on them for finding a way into the playoffs. And again, Mike Tomlin. This comes back to that culture conversation. Tomlin, obviously a former defensive coordinator, and he filled in and called defensive plays this past week with Keith Butler battling COVID, and Terrell Austin, another guy who might be in the head coaching mix for some teams. He was right there with Tomlin calling plays, so that's interesting. But for the most part, when you think of Mike Tomlin, you think about what he does in the locker room, right? Keeping Antonio Brown in check, keeping Le'Veon Bell on the tracks. So really impressive work again this year from Mike Tomlin. And you think back to the Duck Hodges, Mason Rudolph year, 8-8, and then this year with Big Ben's final season, he's by far the worst quarterback to make the playoffs. God bless him, but 9-7-1 in that year. Tomlin, that Hall of Fame resume is really speaking for itself. We're on to the top 16, and I talked about the Minnesota Vikings are at 16. Preseason I had them at number 10, and I mean I bought into the town on this team. And granted, when this team had Danielle Hunter, they had at least one player you could count on getting pass rush consistently. Once he gets hurt, that subsides, and it leaves the secondary out to dry that much more. But even the secondary was pretty rough the first 4 to 5 weeks of the year. And they have announced the firing of Mike Zimmer and GM Rich Spielman, which makes things interesting. I feel like they're going to probably shop Kirk Cousins now, considering they moved on from Spielman as well. But this is a spot where I think if Clint Kubiak isn't the OC, and there were a lot of times where you could just feel him kind of going into a shell and playing a little too conservative, not taking full advantage of, hey, we have maybe the best pass-catching duo in the league with Jefferson and Thielen on top of Dalvin Cook and, competent enough tight ends on the roster, and Kirk Cousins playing really well this year for the most part. Let's sling it around. A lot of, third down and long draws, a lot of early down running plays. So maybe this is a chance where maybe a Kellen Moore, if he's someone they're interested in, or a Doug Peterson, who has a track record of offensive success, looks at this roster and says, you're going to give me Kirk Cousins? Final year of his deal. He might be shocked, but You're going to give me Justin Jefferson. You're going to give me Dalvin Cook. You're going to give me potential, Pro Bowl left tackle. Christian Darrisaw looked really good when we saw him this year. I think some offensive coaches are going to love the idea of taking this job. That makes it a little interesting how you piece up the defense. The secondary is really bad. Danielle Hunter might want to get out after this year, and then they're left with no quality pass rushers in my eyes. So it's an interesting team. Obviously, slipped from my expectations, and they're right around this no man's land, right? Some years they're right above average. This year, obviously, 8-9. They're a little below average, and change is kind of necessary for them to be able to make their way to the Super Bowl down the line. Los Angeles Chargers, here we go. I'm sure you haven't heard enough about this Sunday Night Football game, but wow, did Brandon Staley fumble the bag calling that timeout in overtime, because it looked like that game was going to be a tie. Both teams get in, and again, I'm saying this as a Steelers fan. That would have been awesome from a football fan perspective, because I'd rather see the Raiders and the Chargers, Derek Carr and Justin Herbert in versus Carr and Big Ben and the Steelers. So as a quality control sort of purpose, and giving the best 7 teams in for the AFC, would have been cool to see a tie, but Staley calls that timeout late. The Chargers decide run one more play, get 10 yards, get in field goal range. Carlson nails the field goal. They're the winner of that contest and heading into the playoffs. But this Chargers team, man, and Sonny in that game really showed it. Like, they start slow, and then all of a sudden they pour 14 points on the board before you can blink. And the next thing you know, they're down 15. And then they complete that comeback, and Justin Herbert's doing ridiculous things left and right, including with 80-yard drive with 2+ minutes left on the clock, and hitting Josh Palmer on this 20-yard dig route to get themselves back into the game, and then makes a ridiculous crossbody throw to Austin Eckler on the 2-point conversion after. He just does so many ridiculous things that you just look at this team and say, why do you make it so hard on yourself? Why do you want to make yourself the opponent here? You already are playing a team lined up across from you. You don't need to make this any harder on yourself. And the Chargers' run defense looks really, really exposed down the stretch. Felt like the Raiders were just, as the game went on, got better and better in that department. And Las Vegas does not have a great offensive line, especially in run blocking. They've really struggled to run the ball this year. So that really shows how weak that unit is for the Chargers. A lot of people are mocking Jordan Davis to them in mock drafts. They might be able to go nose tackle on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, get better value, and then use that first rounder on a corner or wide receiver. I think is an appetizing option, especially like a Chris Olave. All of that to say, this team, and last night showed it, when they play their best, can play with anybody, and that's why I want to see them in the playoffs. But they also can play down to competition, and they can be such a disappointing team to watch because of that. And if they just figure out a way to be more consistent in year 2 under Staley, year 3 with Justin Herbert, and he's in a tough spot. Do you move on from Joe Lombardi, or do you hope he can change how he looks at the game and get better as a play caller? Or are you saying, hey, Joe, sorry, didn't work out. Justin, you're going to have your 3rd offensive coordinator in 3 years. Neither option feels really great for the Chargers. They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place in that area. But I still buy into Staley. I still buy into Herbert. One more offseason. Patch up the run defense, get a couple more weapons on the outside, and this team is as good as any in the AFC if they can learn to be consistent, and that's obviously a huge asterisk to lean on. Colts down 5 spots, but they're up 5 for my preseason ranking. So I was obviously, along with the Saints, I was fading the Colts. I don't buy into Carson Wentz, and I was iffy about their playmaking situation. I like Michael Pittman. He took a bigger step forward than I was anticipating, and Wentz, for about 75% of the year, felt like he played a clean, safe brand of football. But then every once in a while, he would just do so many head-scratching decisions in games. And, he did not play well against the Jags. And, that's one of the worst defenses in football. That is a fraudulent type of performance for the Colts. Win and you're in the playoffs. Cool. Get embarrassed. That was the last thing anybody expected. Not only to lose, but get embarrassed by the Jags. That is a tough scene. And it's really tough because I love Frank Reich, and that running game is really fun to watch. The offensive line is fantastic, and they have some great playmakers on the defensive side, like Darius Leonard, creates turnovers left and right, like Matt Eberflus is the defensive coordinator. I just couldn't get the job done. And that's kind of what happens. When you have these middle-of-the-road quarterbacks, you have one of 2 outcomes. You have Jimmy Garoppolo making some big throws down the stretch against the Rams, and, hey, if he can make 1 or 2 throws, that's all we need. Or you can even say the Colts a couple weeks ago against the Cardinals, right? Wentz was not good for that game. But then he hits Doolin in the back of the end zone, dime, and boom. Colts are, right back where we thought they were, and they're in the playoff conversation, and they beat the Cardinals on the road on Christmas Day. Awesome win, right? That wasn't the case against Jacksonville. And that's the tough part about riding with these middle-of-the-road, non-elite quarterbacks. So disappointing way to end the year for the Colts, but they are up from my preseason expectations. So a little bit for Indy fans to hang their hat on. Raiders up a ton, and I said it in my picks video, and I even did it some myself. Sprinkle a little bit on that Raiders money line because every time I have counted this team out and I have assumed they would not make the playoffs, they proved me wrong. Started on Thanksgiving on the road against the Cowboys. I said, okay, they're going to lose this game to Dallas and they're going to fade quietly throughout the rest of the season like they do every year. They get a hot start in the first half and they become irrelevant in the second half. They win that game. And then, they get embarrassed by Cincinnati. They're kind of win a game here, lose a game there. Okay, the Raiders are just kind of irrelevant now. And they'll lose at Indianapolis. Another game, the Colts, if they win that game, it's not a problem in Week 18 what happens. But the Raiders steal it on the road, and they keep the door ajar. And then, of course, on Sunday Night Football, they won a thriller, awesome picture here. This was from the Raiders' Twitter. Taking down a division rival. And that game could have ended a tie. Both teams get in. Instead, they're the victors. They earn the playoff spot, and they're going to take on the Bengals. And like I said, every time I count out the Raiders, they find a way to win. And this is a really interesting team to talk about the head coaching discussion. I know this video is starting to get a little long, but if Rick Bisaccia gets a win in the playoffs and they take down the Bengals on the road, there's no way you don't offer him the head coaching job, which then makes this really an interesting setting because the Raiders will have a new regime with familiar faces. And what I mean by that is John Gruden had a 51 to 49% control on player personnel over Mike Mayock. I'm sure Mayock had some decisions in there and some input, but it was ultimately John Gruden making the final decisions on player personnel. That's now going to be Mike Mayock's call. And Rick Bisaccia, special teams coach, clearly he's got this team buying in despite the Gruden scandal, but despite the Henry Ruggs terrible situation. Damon Arnett gets cut for his off-the-field issues. Nate Hobbs, was he not, driving under the influence? They find him, asleep in his car, well above the BAC level. It just felt like they got thrown every obstacle possible, and Rick Bisaccia kept this team on the track, and they kept moving forward. And now they're in the playoffs, and they got to 10 wins. That is unbelievable, given everything they've been through. So even now, it's kind of hard to move on from Bisaccia. So then what do, right? Do you hire a Joe Brady as your offensive coordinator and a Brian Flores as your DC, or you hire a new head coach, or maybe Rick Bisaccia says, hey, after this year, I'm getting up there in age. I was always a special teams coach. I don't want to be a head coach. And then at that point, you open up the door, and I think Jim Harbaugh is their guy. I think Jim Harbaugh is exactly who the Raiders want to hire. But if Rick Bisaccia wins this game, there's no way you're taking that job away from him. And then your search becomes, what coordinators can we find to replace Greg Olson and Gus Bradley, who are just not it if you want to win a Super Bowl. Tangent aside, a really impressive season for the Raiders, and good on them for getting the playoffs, given everything they've gone through. They have 10 wins on the year, but it feels like they have like 14, given everything they've had to overcome. So, a ton of credit there to Carr and the Raiders. Cardinals up 5 spots. We talked about them. I had them in Seattle, neck and neck in my preseason rankings, but one team answered a bunch of questions I had about them, and the other one didn't. So, one is down to the 20s, one's up to 12 and playing in the postseason. So, give a ton of credit to Arizona, right? About 80% of the year, I'd say Kyler Murray did play like an MVP candidate. Now, there were some bad games in there, and honestly, the MVP race this year is, I don't want to call it fraudulent, but it's a little disappointing in the sense that if it's Brady or if it's Rodgers, there's still some games in there where you can pick and choose between whoever's resume you think deserves it the most as undeserving, right? Whether it is Dak, whether it's Kyler, whether it's Aaron Rodgers, whether it's Tom Brady. They've all kind of had those weird games where you're like, they really weren't anything special, or they played really bad there. But I think Kyler Murray, for the most part this year, did take a step forward. And Cliff Kingsbury, I think, did some minor improvements. Now, the offense did get stale as the year went on, but also not having DeAndre Hopkins the last couple weeks of the regular season. Arizona hopes to get him back sometime in the playoffs. That would obviously be a huge addition. But for the most part, they got a ton more out of A.J. Green than I would have anticipated. I like the little bit they used Rondale Moore. I wish I could have seen more of him. They acquire Zach Ertz in the middle of the year, and he opens up the middle of the field exponentially. They signed James Conner as this one-off running back because the Steelers made him look like he was trash, and that's an interesting what if Pittsburgh use that first-round pick on an offensive lineman, keep James Conner. Is that running game better? That's an interesting thought experiment. But instead, James Conner scores 16 touchdowns this year with Arizona and supersedes Chase Edmonds pretty much as the main running back in that offense. Really impressive. And then if I'm giving out a coordinator of the year vote, which I'm obviously not, Vance Joseph is my guy. That defense, by far, superseded my expectations, especially the secondary. Like, Budda Baker's the only name of relevance in that group. They found a way week in and week out for the most part this season to take away passing attacks. Like, that might have been their biggest strength this year. So, ton of credit to the Cardinals. They really did supersede my expectations. I'm excited to see them in the playoffs. And them and the Rams, Monday Night Football, Wild Card Weekend. I'm beyond pumped for this upcoming slate of action. The Patriots down to number 11 after they lose to Miami. They are still in the playoffs, and they will take on Buffalo in a divisional AFC East battle in Orchard Park in Buffalo. And this team, see preseason ranking right around this area at 12. This feels about right. This team kind of played to what we thought the expectations were. Maybe the player that superseded him for the most part this year was Mac Jones. But even, down the stretch, past couple of weeks, you still saw he's a little limited. He's not a game-breaking guy. He does feel like his scouting report. He's the most pro-ready. You can plug him into an offense right now and get some decent production. And for the most part, that's what we got. Still hasn't taken that next leap to be, what we think maybe you have with Trevor Lawrence, what you think you might have with Justin Fields and Zack Wilson, where it's like, this guy can win you games. We haven't quite seen that from Mac Jones just yet. Maybe some moments, but not quite full games. But this New England team is alive as ever. They have the best head coach in NFL history. They have a good defense, a lot of depth on that side of the football, and you get a couple big throws from Mac Jones. You can run the football efficiently. That's all it takes. One takedown Buffalo, and then from that point onward, get that momentum moving forward. Anything is possible once you reach the playoffs. Philadelphia Eagles and Cincinnati Bengals, the biggest movers on this list. Biggest movers on this list. I was going to say maybe the Browns, but Eagles and Bengals each move up. What is that? 20 spots. 20 spots. These are the two teams that I saw as the third and fourth worst teams in the NFL. And this is totally an opportunity for you to criticize me. But let me explain myself. For the Eagles and for the Bengals, for that part, I didn't buy into the coaching staff. It felt like Nick Sirianni was just like, hey, we need to hire a head coach, so you're going to be here for a year. And Zach Taylor, I was like, hey, he's going to get himself fired this season. So I didn't buy into either one of those situations. And because of that, I didn't see Joe Burrow playing like a potential MVP candidate in a lot of ways. And because I didn't see Zach Taylor handing over the offense and it being as efficient as it was, I like Jamar Chase. But the numbers he put up this year were beyond my expectations. In addition to that, if you were to show me those Chase numbers, I would not have seen T. Higgins or Tyler Boyd having the year and the production that they did have for the most part this year. So that offense really did outplay my expectations in Cincinnati. And the defense was really nice. They had enough pass rush, and they have a lot of deep NFL quality secondary players on top of, Jesse Bates is a great safety. Took a little bit of a step back this year, but still a phenomenal player. They have made enough strides in that side of the football to be a playoff caliber team. And for the Eagles, I didn't buy into Sirianni. I'm a little bit higher on Hurts than most. This year, I think he fully took a step forward. Now, he's still not a great player, and his rushing ability gives him a nice floor to build off of. But as the year's gone on, you start to see a throw there, or a throw here, and you're like, okay, well, I can buy into this. Plus, the rushing attack, once Sirianni just put his head down and say, we're going to be a running football team, this offense got really hard to contain because they had a good offensive line and they have a number of quality runners, including Jalen Hurts. And then once you have to commit to that run, Dallas Goedert's a more than capable receiving back. And Devonta Smith has been flashy in the sense that when they actually look in his direction, he can beat anybody as a route runner. And Jalen Reagor, had some moments, I suppose, but Greg Ward had some games as well. So still think they need to add a little bit to those pass-catching cores. But that offense has found its stride and molded into a nice little niche. And then the defense, they play a very conservative style and a lot of zone. They want to keep the ball in front of you, limit big plays. But that, with a good pass rush, despite it getting a little old, it has been proven to be good enough. So the Eagles and the Bengals, how about this? Biggest risers, biggest movers in general from my preseason to my final power rankings. And a ton of credit. These two teams earned their spot in the playoffs. It wasn't fluky. It was merit. It was deserved. And I'm excited to see them play this upcoming weekend. We're on to the top 8. The Tennessee Titans stayed exactly where I had them. I feel like a genius. The one team that stayed put, the 49ers and the Rams basically switched spots, so they're pretty much right there. But Tennessee, man. And I'm kind of tempted once I do my playoff predictions later this week. You might see this team in the Super Bowl for me because they're getting Derrick Henry back. You get that first round bye, so you're only playing 3 games as opposed to 4. You're just limiting the amount of error that could be had. But again, you look at this team, and Ryan Tannehill, when he's had his full weapons, it's been fantastic. Derrick Henry coming back, if he's anywhere near what he was to begin this year, or just who he's been in the years prior, that's a huge addition. It changes so much about what this team can do, especially when that defense is playing as good as it's been all year. If you have that level of a defense and then the ability on the offensive side to shrink the game and keep the clock rolling and keep that defense fresh, this team is dangerous. And that's not even talking about the wide receivers, folks. Julio Jones back off the COVID list. And I know Julio, and I said this last week, he's washed. He's washed in the sense that he is not going to be the number one wide receiver in the league. But week 2 against Seattle, I think he still has that type of potential where he could go for 100 yards, a touchdown or 2. And because he can do that, and in a one-game setting, maybe it's the divisional, or maybe it's the conference championship, maybe it's in the Super Bowl if they make it there. If he has that one game where he turns back the clock, he has the potential to be the most dominant player on the field for that one game. And you have to respect that. That makes the life of A.J. Brown that much easier, which in turn makes Ryan Tannehill's life that much easier. And if you're having to respect those passing game options, guess what? The rushing attack is that much more lethal. So I am all in on this Titans team right now. As you can see, I'm getting giddy talking about it. Not even a Tennessee fan. But this feels like the perfect situation for my money. Mike Vrabel, Coach of the Year, him or LaFleur in Green Bay. They both done fantastic jobs. I think Mike Vrabel has overcome a ton. 91 players have played on the roster for Tennessee this year. That is unfathomable. So I'm excited to see what this Tennessee team does once we see them in the playoffs. Obviously, they have the first round bye, so we won't see them this weekend. Rams, 49ers switch spots for my preseason rankings. What a fun game this was. And talking about the Rams, you got the full Matt Stafford, kind of cycle the first half. I mean, the ball placement on some of these tutties was perfect. The Tyler Higbee fade in the right corner of the end zone. Couldn't have thrown it better. If I was Sean McVay, I'm running to the end zone because that was a dot. And that was like why you bring in Matt Stafford, because he can make that type of throw. And, even the Cooper Kupp tutty, you're like, dude, all right, Stafford's putting it on the money. But he is a gunslinger, and sometimes it feels like he makes a couple of those throws early. He feels a little enabled, and then you get, the turnover at the very end of the game that basically seals the deal, and the Niners win it. So it's a little bit of a give and take. You want Stafford to play with confidence, and you want him to take those shots, and you love the ball placement on some of these throws, and overall he played pretty well. But then sometimes that overconfidence or just that gambler mentality he can have and the trust in his arm can lead to interceptions and turnovers. Pretty sure he led the NFL in interceptions, which just, it feels about right. Like he has the capability to be this unbelievable arm talent, gaudy type of throw maker, and then he can also be the guy who chucks it right at a linebacker against Tennessee and it becomes, a touchdown the other way, or, cost you a game and, overtime against the 49ers. So it's a really tough spot, but that said, Matt Stafford, if he can just put together 4 games of clean football, this team is as dangerous as any in the NFL. And same with the San Francisco 49ers. The rushing attack is there. I'm really glad Elijah Mitchell's back and healthy. Perfect fit for that rushing attack. And Jimmy Garoppolo made some throws late. This is, again, we talked about Carson Wentz earlier. When you get these middle-of-the-pack type of quarterbacks, you're rolling the dice. When this game comes down to a throw or 2 being made, are they going to make it? And some quarterbacks have that natural ability to kind of rise up and be there for that occasion and make those big moments like an Eli Manning, though Eli, I think, had a couple of elite years in him, but for the majority of his career, you probably wouldn't put him in that, top 5 elite category. But when the moment came, that dude rose to the occasion. I'm not even a Giants fan saying that. And Jimmy Garoppolo in this setting definitely did. He came up with some big throws down the stretch, and look at Stafford kind of forced himself into a bad spot, and obviously the turnover late to give San Francisco the win. Can Jimmy G do that? Yeah. Will he do it for 4 games in the playoffs? That's the tough part, and that's where I think this 49ers team has at least put themselves in a spot where they have backup options, right? You have Trey Lance obviously on the bench, so who knows if Garoppolo is really selling you and he throws 2 picks in the first half and in your wild card game, I wouldn't be surprised to see Trey Lance take over and try to will them back into that game and try to get the win, advance to the divisional round, obviously. But also this team can win by being a ground and pound offense and then using Deebo Samuel as a running back and setting up play action then for George Kittle and just getting him in a yak situation. Same for Brandon Ayuk and even Deebo Samuel as a pass catcher, using him in yak spots. And then that defense has enough pass rush, and they're starting to get healthy in the secondary. Now they're not huge names that are coming back, but they are still getting players back off of IR and off the COVID list. They're starting to put more bodies in that area, which will go a long way, just keeping that defense afloat. So I'm really excited for the San Francisco team. You can see preseason-wise, I was as high on them as anybody. They had the 3rd best Super Bowl odds coming into the year from Vegas, so maybe not that high, but yeah, I was all about the San Francisco team coming into the year, and pretty happy with how they've ended the season. Cowboys, another big mover, and a big reason why I saw him at 13 was his offense is awesome. I'm a huge Kellen Moore fan, and I think he got even better as a play caller. Some of his tactician is right. If that initial game plan wasn't there, took them a little bit to settle into an adjustment, but for the most part, the offense was stellar, and especially against Philadelphia, it felt like they left the offense out there to like, hey, let's get some positive momentum. Let's make sure we're clicking on all cylinders before we get to the playoffs. 5 touchdowns for Dak Prescott. I'd say they're clicking. But the defense is why they're in the top 5, right? And it's not necessarily, a unit that's all world, but you have 2 quality starting edges that then allow you to use Micah Parsons as just an unfair bully against guards, just picking off, hey, who do I want to have Micah Parsons rush against? Okay, it's Eric Flowers this week. Oh, okay, it's this team's right guard who is not very good at pass protection. We're just going to go ahead and pick on him a little bit. And he's also great in coverage. And then the secondary has enough playmakers. And Trevon Diggs, I know he's kind of a boomer bust guy, giving up over 1,000 yards in coverage, but hey, double-digit picks, that ability, in a lot of ways, it's worth the trade-off, because with that offense, especially if they're clicking, think of that Washington game. Let's say that game was close to start. Trevon Diggs takes away a possession away from a team and then gives it back to that offense. When they're rolling, that's a potential 14-point swing right there, and that's huge, especially once you get into the playoffs. So I think there's enough playmakers in the back end. I love the pass rush for Dallas, especially when they're fully healthy with Gregory and with a DeMarcus Lawrence and a Micah Parsons in the mix. That's when I think they're at their best, and the offense has to be clicking, obviously, but this team's as dangerous as it gets. And big reason why they went from 13 to 5 my preseason to final rankings is because the defense took a huge step forward. Ton of credit to Dan Quinn, of course. Bills up a spot for my preseason rankings, and a little weird game against the Jets. That game played a lot closer, but Bills eventually did get to cover the spread, and the ability to run the football down the stretch has been really impressive. And it might just be, hey, we're going to get to the playoffs, and now we're going to force teams to respect what Devin Singletary might be able to do as a runner, and obviously Josh Allen's a threat with his legs anytime he suits up. But maybe this is a legit backup plan for this team, where Singletary's looked pretty good. He's looked elusive. He's been able to break off big runs. Maybe this is a spot where, hey, you get in the playoffs, and I guess a team like the Patriots in the wild card, maybe J.C. Jackson takes away Stephon Diggs. And Bill Belichick has it schemed up on the back end where there's not a whole lot to work with in the passing game. Okay, but they're playing a lot of too high. Let's go to Devin Singletary. Let's run read option plays with him and Josh Allen and force them to stop the run. And you know what? That as a fallback plan makes that offense that much more deadly. And again, I said this last week, even despite Tre'Davious White, this secondary is holding up, and they've had just enough pass rush to be good enough and be one of the best defenses in football, right? I look at that side of the football, they're just like a B caliber defense. They have a good enough secondary, enough pass rush, but both of those things together put them in a spot where they're one of the best defenses in the NFL. So obviously very high on this Bills team. Excited to see them play the Patriots this upcoming weekend. The Bucs were number 1 team in the preseason power rankings. They're down to 3, but they're still live as it gets. Granted, if this team had Antonio Brown and Chris Godwin for the playoffs, you don't have the controversy, you don't have the injury, and I knew Lenny Fournette was going to be back for the playoffs. This team's probably number 1. They took care of business down the stretch against Tampa Bay, and Tom Brady may well be the MVP. If he's not the winner, he's probably the runner-up behind Aaron Rodgers. So this team's still really good. They're getting players off the COVID list, and single game settings, they have a ton of players who can just take over a game. On the opposite side, it could be Mike Evans, it could be Leonard Fournette when he comes back, it could be the tight ends. Gronk could score a couple of tutties and be the story of the game. And Tom Brady's obviously fantastic in the postseason. And then on the defensive side, it could be Shaquille Barrett tearing you apart. It could be Joe Tryon-Shoyinka having some big moments down the stretch. The linebackers, Levante David, Devin White, they are obviously big playmakers waiting to make plays. And then Vita Vea just single-handedly takes away the inside run game, it feels like, whenever he suits up and whoever the Bucs are playing. So this team is obviously as dangerous as it gets. So for sure, they got to be in that Super Bowl contender category. Packers at number 2, Kansas City at number 1, 4 and 2, respectively, in my preseason power rankings. These two teams got it rolling right now. For Green Bay, you lose to the Lions, but you only play your starters for the first half, so that's why they're down from, if you remember last week's power rankings, they were 1, now they're 2. If they play their starters that entire game, I feel pretty confident Green Bay wins. But you got the opportunity to keep everybody fluid, avoid as much rust as possible before you have the first round bye, obviously, this weekend, but also get some additional rest, so it's like 6 quarters of rest a week and then half of week 18. But you still got to get them out there, and they look solid when they were playing against the Lions. So that's a good sign. The starters still look like they got it. And again, those reinforcements will eventually come. Jair Alexander, David Bakhtiari, and Zadarius Smith. Excited to see when that comes. And obviously, with those names coming back, the first round bye is huge for this team. So obviously, very live Super Bowl contenders, and may well be my pick to make it to the Super Bowl in the NFC. You'll have to see on Thursday. Kansas City, the number 1 team. The offense, it wasn't great necessarily against Denver. They gave them a whole lot of too high looks, and Patrick Mahomes still had those turnover-worthy plays this week and last. They just didn't turn into interceptions. But that said, this offense has shown that maybe there's not as many big plays and 60, 50, 70-yard chunks. Kind of did that out of order there, but they may not have the big playability that they did in years past, but they're content then with rolling out with 12, 17-yard drives to start games and getting 7 the hard way. And then, obviously they played this past week with a very hobbled Tyreek Hill, but getting those playmakers the football as the check down options, whether it's Kelsey, whether it's Hill. If that's where they're forced to go, they feel content doing that. And then obviously CEH is a nice pass-catching option out of the backfield. So still think this team is rolling. That's just the opposite side. The defense has been pretty stellar all year long, right? You look at maybe the definitive play against Denver was the scoop and score 6 for Nick Bolton. That's what this team can do that they just weren't doing weeks 1 through 5 or whatever. When you look at the defense, and it might have been one of the worst I've seen in NFL history for a team that has Super Bowl aspirations. So they've come a long way on that side. They've started to figure out the defense. The offense. They've had to play in a lot of different ways, and I appreciate their ability to win in a variety of different ways. So the Kansas City Chiefs in the regular season is my number 1 team in the NFL. Sorry for a bit of a longer video, but hopefully you all enjoyed today's video. If you did, hit that like button. It would help me out a ton. And if you're new to the channel, want to see more football content, just hit that big red subscribe button. And of course, join me down below in the comments section. Who do I have too high? Who do I have too low? Who's your favorite team? Where do you think they should fit into these power rankings? Love to talk some ball with you in the comments section. But that's going to do it for me. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And until next time, my name is Tej, and I'm signing off.